He told her never to show her face again. So she didn't. Until the day he collapsed, and she was the only one there to save him. The elevator doors had just slid shut. 40 floors of silence above them. And Kang Ji-woo, the man whose name made grown men lower their voices in 3 different countries, was on the floor, clutching his chest, eyes wide, looking up at the one woman in the world he had personally, deliberately, permanently removed from his life. And Jennifer Smith was just standing there, staring at him, not moving. Before we go on, let me ask you something quickly. I've been wondering where people who enjoy stories like this are actually watching from these days. Are you the type watching on your phone in bed, sneaking it on your laptop at work, or sitting comfortably in your living room with your TV? Tell me in the comments, and also tell me where in the world you're watching from. I'm honestly curious. Do people still use tablets for this, or is that phase gone? And if you're new here, welcome. Hit subscribe, because we tell stories here that you will not find anywhere else. Now let's get back to Jennifer. She had a radio clipped to her belt. One press of a button and this whole thing would be over. Security would flood the elevator shaft. Paramedics would be called. Kang Ji-woo would survive. One press. She didn't press it. Not yet. Because for 60 seconds, 60 of the longest seconds of her life, Jennifer Smith stood in that elevator and let herself feel something she had been pushing down for 6 months. The humiliation of being escorted out of a building she had given everything to. The image of his face when he looked at her like she was nothing. The sound of his voice, so calm it was almost gentle, telling her to never let him see her face again. She let herself feel all of it. And then Kang Ji-woo said a name. One word, barely above a whisper, forced out through a chest that was failing him. He said her brother's name. He said Emeka. And Jennifer Smith dropped to her knees. But we have to go back. Because none of this makes sense without understanding who Jennifer was before that elevator. Who she was before Kang Ji-woo. Before the tower. Before the night everything she had carefully built got dismantled in a single, quiet conversation on the 40th floor. Jennifer Ade Smith was born in Lagos, raised partly in London, and built entirely by herself. That is not a metaphor. Her father worked double shifts at a logistics company in Peckham for 11 years so that Jennifer and her younger brother Emeka could have the kind of education that would make their grandmother cry with pride back in Nigeria. Jennifer understood the weight of that sacrifice before she was old enough to fully articulate it. She understood it the way children of immigrants always understand it, not through conversation, but through observation. Through watching her father's hands. Through the particular silence in the house on the days the bills came in. So she became exceptional. Not in the showy way. In the quiet, surgical, undeniable way. She graduated top of her class in accounting at the London School of Economics. She turned down 3 offers before accepting a position at a forensic accounting firm that worked primarily with international financial crime units. She was good at finding things that weren't supposed to be found. She was good at following money through rooms it wasn't supposed to be in. She was, in the most practical sense, exactly the kind of person that a man like Kang Ji-woo should never have let through his door. But he did. Not directly. That's not how these things work. The offer came through a consulting firm, Meridian Advisory Group, with offices in Atlanta, Singapore, and Seoul. Clean website. Legitimate-looking client list. Genuinely competitive salary. Jennifer was brought on to audit the financial reporting structures of what she was told were several mid-sized Korean tech companies with cross-border holdings. For the first 2 months, everything looked exactly like what it was supposed to look like. Then she started finding the rooms. Not obviously. Not all at once. It was a transaction that didn't quite balance, a wire transfer routed through a Luxembourg holding company that had no employees and no physical address. Then another. Then a pattern. Then a structure so elegant and so deliberately complex that Jennifer actually stopped working for a full minute and just stared at her screen, because whoever had built this knew exactly what they were doing. She should have walked out that day. She knew that. Even then, she knew it. But that same week, running a cross-reference she told herself was purely routine, she found a payment record attached to a name she recognized. Emeka Chukwemeka Smith. Her brother's full legal name. Attached to a courier payment. Dated 14 months ago. 3 weeks before he stopped returning her calls. If you've ever had a missing person in your family, if you know that specific silence, that specific dread, then you already understand what happened inside Jennifer's chest when she saw that name on her screen. It wasn't panic. Panic is loud. This was quieter than that. This was the feeling of a door swinging open in a dark room and not being able to see what's on the other side, but knowing absolutely that you have to walk through it. She closed the file. She went home. She cooked dinner she didn't eat. And the next morning, she went back and she started digging. Drop a comment right now and tell me if you found your missing sibling's name buried in a criminal organization's financial records, what would you do? Walk away or go deeper? Let me know below. And if you're not subscribed yet, now is a good time. The thing about following money is that it never really hides. People think money hides, but it doesn't. It moves. It changes shape. It wears different names and passes through different countries and sits in accounts attached to companies that technically exist, but functionally don't. But it always leaves a trail, because every transaction requires two parties, and two parties means two records, and two records means somewhere, in some server in some jurisdiction, the truth is sitting quietly, waiting for someone patient enough to find it. Jennifer was that patient. Over 6 weeks, she built a map. Not a physical one, it lived entirely in her head, and in an encrypted folder on a personal hard drive she kept at her flat, never in the office. The map connected Meridian Advisory Group to 17 shell companies across 4 continents. Those companies connected to a logistics and import network operating out of Busan and Incheon. That network connected to a name that appeared exactly once in the documents she could access and never again, Director Kwon. No first name in any of the files. Just Director Kwon, attached to a payment authorization that moved a sum of money large enough to make Jennifer sit very still for a very long time. And threading through all of it, in ways that were clearly intentional, was the infrastructure of the Kang organization. She hadn't known the name Kang Ji-woo when she walked into Meridian. She knew it now. She also knew that Emika's payment was connected to the Incheon logistics arm. A courier payment. Which meant her brother, who was 26 years old and studying for a real estate license and had no business being anywhere near any of this, had at some point done a job for these people. The question that kept Jennifer awake was whether he had done it knowing what they were, or whether he had simply needed money and taken a courier job that looked unremarkable on the surface. She needed access to one more layer of records. Records that lived on a server inside the Meridian building. Records she wasn't authorized to access from her workstation. She got them anyway. It took her 3 nights and a level of technical creativity that she had never disclosed on any professional application, but she got them. And what she found made the floor feel unsteady beneath her. The Incheon operation was a front for something that connected directly to Director Kwon, who was not just any official, but a senior figure in South Korean national intelligence. Kang Ji-woo wasn't just laundering money. He was managing a relationship with someone who had the power to make investigations disappear, border records vanish, and people become very difficult to locate. Jennifer copied everything. Encrypted it. Prepared to walk out of the building with it on a drive the size of her thumbnail hidden in the lining of her bag. She almost made it. The lobby was 4 steps away when her phone buzzed. A message from an internal number she didn't recognize. 4 words. Come to the 40th floor. She stood in the lobby for a moment. The exit was right there. She could have walked through it. Taken the tube home. Called someone, Interpol, a journalist, anyone. She went to the 40th floor. She would ask herself why for months afterward. The most honest answer she ever arrived at was this: she needed to know if he knew about Emika. And the only person who could tell her that was the man sitting behind the desk at the end of the room, in front of floor-to-ceiling windows that made the Seoul skyline look like a painting behind him. Kang Ji-woo was 51 years old and looked like a man who had decided sometime in his 40s that he was finished being anything other than exactly himself. No performance. No warmth deployed for strategic effect. He was lean in the way that people who have always been disciplined are lean, not from effort but from disposition. He was dressed simply. He had reading glasses on the desk that he didn't put on. He looked at Jennifer the way someone looks at something they find genuinely interesting, not threatening, not warm. Interested. He said, "Sit down, Miss Smith." She sat down. He said, "You found Director Kwon." Not a question. Jennifer said nothing. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "You weren't looking for Director Kwon. You were looking for your brother." Her face didn't move. Years of professional discipline. Her face did not move. But something in her chest cracked clean in half. He had known. He had known about Emika from the beginning. He had known why she was really there, or at least he had suspected it, and he had watched her work, watched her dig, watched her get closer and closer to things that could destroy a very carefully constructed arrangement with a very powerful man. And he had let her. To see how far she would go. To see what she would do when she found it. She had failed whatever test that was, not by looking, he told her, but by preparing to take what she found outside his walls. What happened next lasted 11 minutes by the clock on the wall behind him. Jennifer counted. He spoke quietly the entire time. No anger. No threats delivered with raised voices. He laid out with complete clarity what she would do: return every file, sign documents his legal team would prepare, and remove herself permanently from his world. He told her that the people she loved were safe as long as she cooperated and stayed gone. And then he said it. The last thing he said before his assistant appeared at the door. "Don't let me see your face again." Jennifer stood up. She walked to the door. She paused with her hand on the frame, not for drama, but because her legs needed a second. Then she walked out. She rode the elevator down 40 floors alone. She walked out of the building into the sole evening air and stood on the pavement and breathed for a long time. A woman passed her walking a small dog. A delivery scooter cut through traffic. The world was completely unbothered. Jennifer flagged a taxi and went home and sat on her bathroom floor for 40 minutes. Then she got up, washed her face, made tea, and opened her laptop. Because Emeka's name was still in those files. And Kang Ji-woo, whatever else he was, knew something about what happened to her brother. And Jennifer Smith had not come this far, had not sacrificed this much, had not carried this particular weight through this many sleepless nights, to walk away with nothing. She was just going to have to be smarter about it. Hit that like button if you felt that. And stay with us, because what Jennifer does next is where this story really begins. 6 months is a long time when you fill it correctly. Jennifer did not spend those 6 months grieving or recovering or waiting for the world to become safer. She spent them building. Quietly. Methodically. With the kind of focused energy that only comes when you have a single, clear objective and no patience left for anything that doesn't serve it. The first thing she did was contact Sonia Adler. Sonia was 62, German-born, and had spent 23 years working financial crime cases for Interpol before retiring to a flat in Amsterdam that she had allegedly never intended to leave. Jennifer had crossed paths with her professionally 2 years earlier during a case that never made it to trial and had quietly filed her name under people worth knowing. Sonia was brilliant, deeply disenchanted with institutions, and had her own unfinished history with the Kang organization, a case from 9 years ago that got quietly buried by people with the kind of access that only money at a certain level can buy. They met in person once, in a coffee shop in Antwerp. After that, everything was encrypted channels. Sonia provided what Jennifer needed most, not information, but architecture. A way of thinking about the Kang organization that went beyond the financial records and into the physical reality of how it operated day to day. It was Sonia who told her about the tower. Kang Ji-woo had owned Yoon Tower. The building was named for his mother's family, a detail that surprised Jennifer for 9 years. He operated from the 40th floor and used the building's private infrastructure with a level of personal routine that had never been disrupted. Same elevator. Same schedule. Same patterns, day after day, because when you control your environment completely you stop seeing the risk in routine. It was also Sonia who mentioned, carefully and with appropriate sourcing, that Ji-woo's cardiologist had filed a private treatment schedule with a clinic in Gangnam 18 months ago. Heart condition. The specific nature of it wasn't something Sonia had been able to access, but the fact of it was confirmed. His own lieutenants didn't know. In a world where weakness is the most dangerous thing you can show, Kang Ji-woo had kept this as close as anything he had ever kept. Jennifer absorbed that information and said nothing. She filed it in the part of her mind where she kept things that might matter later. What she wanted was not violence. She needed to make that clear to herself repeatedly over those 6 months, because there were nights when the line got blurry and she had to sit with that and be honest about it. She didn't want Ji-woo dead. Dead men don't tell you where your brother is. Dead men don't answer questions. Dead men don't make deals. What she wanted was a conversation. On her terms. With leverage. She still had the Director Kwan files. She had kept one copy, hidden in a way that she was confident nobody in Ji-woo's organization had located. That copy was her insurance and her bargaining chip. If she could get Ji-woo alone for 10 minutes with a recording device running and the Kwan files as the stakes, she could get him to tell her what she needed to know about Emeka. That was the plan. Getting back into the tower was the problem. She solved it the way she solved every problem, systematically. It took 3 weeks to build a new identity and another 2 to get placed with a contracted facilities maintenance company that serviced several commercial buildings in the district, including, on a rotating schedule, Yoon Tower. She learned the building from the ground up. Literally. She started in the basement and worked outward. She memorized camera positions and rotation intervals. She noted which guards took early lunch and which ones swapped shift 5 minutes before the hour. She identified the service routes that ran parallel to the main corridors and the loading entrance on the north side that had a 6-second gap in coverage every time the freight elevator was called to sublevel 2. And she mapped the elevator. His elevator. The one that ran on a private circuit between floors 38 and 40, accessible only with a specific keycard and only during business hours. The one he used exclusively for his movement between his private office and the floors below. She identified a 3-hour window each Tuesday when maintenance access to that elevator's mechanical housing was possible without triggering a security flag. She got herself assigned to that rotation. Her plan was to be in position on a Tuesday, to time her presence in the elevator when Ji-woo was making his midday transit, to have the recording device running and the Quan files on a drive in her pocket, and to look him in the eye and have the conversation that the 40th floor hadn't allowed her to have. The plan was good. The plan was careful. The plan accounted for almost everything. It did not account for the fact that Kang Ji-woo's heart had apparently decided that particular Tuesday was the day it was done cooperating. Comment below, have you ever had a plan that was absolutely perfect until the one thing you couldn't control showed up? Because Jennifer is about to find out what that feels like in real time. Subscribe if you're not already, and let's get to the elevator. The maintenance shift started at 9:10. Jennifer arrived at the north entrance with her ID badge, her tool bag, and the quiet, practiced unremarkability of someone who belonged there. She had been on this rotation for 3 weeks. The guard at the entrance knew her face the way you know the face of someone you've seen regularly without ever having a real conversation, recognition without attention. She signed in. She took the service corridor to sublevel 1. She did 40 minutes of genuine maintenance work on an HVAC panel because doing the actual job was the best cover for doing the other job. At 10 minutes to 11, she made her way to the mechanical housing for the private elevator. The recording device was already running, clipped inside the breast pocket of her coveralls. The drive with the Quan files was in the left breast pocket. She had rehearsed what she would say so many times that it no longer felt like rehearsal. It felt like memory, like something that had already happened and she was simply walking toward it. She entered the elevator from the maintenance access point at the base of the shaft. The plan was to be inside and stationary before Ji-woo's keycard triggered the call. His midday transit was consistent, 11 o'clock, floor 40 to 38, then back up. In the 37 days she had been studying his routine, he had varied this by more than 4 minutes exactly once. She pressed herself to the far side of the elevator, adjusted her cap, kept her eyes down. At 3 minutes past 11, the elevator moved. It stopped at 40. The doors opened. And Kang Ji-woo stepped in. He was on a phone call. He stepped in without looking up, pressed the button for 38 with the kind of automatic movement that comes from doing something 10,000 times, and stayed on his call. Jennifer kept her eyes on the floor panel. Her heart was doing something she chose not to examine too closely. She had perhaps 30 seconds before they reached 38. She needed him off the phone. Then the phone call ended on its own. Ji-woo lowered the phone. And in the way that people sometimes sense a presence before they register it consciously, he paused. Then he looked up. He looked at Jennifer. She looked at him. For 2 seconds, nothing happened. Then something moved across his face, not anger, not surprise exactly. Something colder than both. Recognition. He said, very quietly, you have got to be. And then he stopped talking. His left hand went to his chest. His right hand went to the wall. The phone clattered to the floor. The sound of it was very loud in the small space. Jennifer watched him go down in stages, not a collapse, more like a controlled descent that lost control halfway through, until he was on the floor with his back against the elevator wall, and the color in his face was doing something deeply wrong. And his breathing was the kind of breathing that makes the air in a room feel different. She stood there. She stood there, and she looked at him, and the radio was right there on her belt, and she did not reach for it. And Kang Ji-woo, this man who had sat behind that desk with all that power arranged around him like furniture, looked up at her from the floor of his own elevator with something in his eyes that Jennifer had genuinely never expected to see there. He was afraid. Not of her. Of what was happening inside his own chest. Of the fact that the most private vulnerability he had been protecting for 18 months had chosen this moment, this specific catastrophic moment, to stop being manageable. Jennifer's mind was doing several things at once. Part of it was clinical. She was assessing. She had basic first aid training. She knew what cardiac distress looked like. She was calculating time and response windows. Part of it was something older and rawer, the part that had ridden a taxi home from this building 6 months ago and sat on a bathroom floor and shook. That part was asking a question she had never let herself ask out loud. What if letting him die was the easiest thing she had ever done? No violence. No confrontation. No negotiation. The elevator opens on 38, and the paramedics are too late, and the man who took everything from her is simply gone, and the question of Emeka remains unanswered, but at least the person responsible for answering it is also gone, and maybe that is a kind of peace, even if it is a terrible kind. She had that thought. She is not ashamed to have had it. She had it fully and completely. And then Kang Ji-woo, with an effort that was visible in every muscle of his face, opened his mouth. His voice was almost nothing. A thread of sound in a metal box. He said one word. Emeka. The floor of Jennifer's chest dropped out. She was on her knees before the thought to move had fully formed. Her hands found his chest. Her training, CPR certification, renewed 18 months ago, the chest compression rhythm she had practiced on a mannequin in a community center, came back with a clarity that felt almost violent. She pressed the radio with one hand while keeping rhythm with the other. Sublevel service elevator, private circuit, between 38 and 40. Medical emergency. Now. Her voice was completely steady. She did not feel steady. Every emotion she had been managing for 6 months was moving through her body at once, the grief and the rage and the exhaustion and the specific pain of hearing her brother's name from this man's mouth and not knowing yet what it meant. All of it was happening at the same time as her hands were pressing down on Kang Ji-woo's chest in the rhythm the mannequin had taught her. He was looking at her the entire time. She was looking back. The elevator was very small. The world outside it did not exist. She kept counting. She kept pressing. The seconds stretched into something that had no relationship to ordinary time. Like this story? Smash the like button and drop a comment. What do you think Ji-woo knows about Emeka? Drop your theory below. We're getting to the part where the truth finally comes out. The doors were pried open 3 minutes and 40 seconds after Jennifer's call. She knew the time because she had been counting compressions, and she was good at counting things even when everything else was falling apart. Security flooded in first, 2 of them, big men in suits who looked at the scene and clearly had not been prepared for what they were seeing. Then a man in a white shirt who Jennifer would later learn was Ji-woo's private physician, kept on building staff for reasons that now made complete sense. He dropped beside her and took over with the practiced efficiency of someone who had prepared for exactly this possibility. Jennifer sat back on her heels. Her hands were shaking. She looked at them like they belonged to someone else. A security guard put a hand on her shoulder and said something in Korean that she didn't need to translate. She stood up. She didn't resist. There was nowhere to go anyway. They were between floors in a private elevator shaft, and the truth was that something in her body had gone very quiet, like a machine that had been running at maximum capacity and had finally, without ceremony, shut down. They took her to a room on the 38th floor. Not aggressively. Not with handcuffs. But firmly, deliberately, in a way that made clear this was not optional and not temporary. The room had a table, 2 chairs, no windows, and a quality of silence that felt intentional. Someone brought her water. No one spoke to her directly. She sat in that room for 2 days. Not 2 hours. 2 days. Food appeared at intervals. Someone came in once to check that she was physically fine and left without answering any of her questions. She slept on the floor because the chair was not built for sleeping, and she had learned a long time ago that sleep was not optional when your body needed it, regardless of the circumstances. On the second day, she stopped trying to reconstruct what was going to happen to her and simply sat with the reality of what had already happened. She had gotten back into the building. She had been in the elevator. Ji-woo had seen her face. And then instead of executing the plan she had spent 6 months constructing with great care and considerable personal risk, she had spent 3.5 minutes doing chest compressions on a man who had told her she was nothing and then disappeared into a hospital somewhere in the building's private medical facilities. She had saved him. She turned that fact over in her mind the way you turn something over in your hands when you're trying to understand the shape of it. She had saved him. On the morning of the 3rd day, the door opened and Ji-ho walked in. She recognized him. She had identified him during her reconnaissance as one of Ji-woo's senior lieutenants, the one who had brought her access log anomaly to Ji-woo's attention 6 months ago. He was younger than he looked in photographs. He placed a phone on the table between them, face down, and sat in the other chair and looked at her without speaking. Jennifer looked back at him without speaking. This went on for a moment. Then Ji-ho said, in accented but precise English, "He wants to talk to you." He turned the phone over. The screen was already active, already connected. He placed it in front of her and stood up and walked to the far corner of the room, far enough to be a presence, but not a participant. Jennifer picked up the phone. She could hear breathing before she heard words. Slow and labored in a way that was new, there was a quality to it that hadn't been there in the elevator, a thinness that the events of the past 2 days had apparently permanently installed. Then his voice. Ms. Smith. She said nothing. He said, "You saved my life." She said, "I heard you say my brother's name." A pause. She could hear the particular silence of a man choosing his words with great care, not because he was unsure of them, but because he understood that the words he was about to say could not be unsaid, and he wanted to be precise. He said, "Emeka came to us 14 months ago. Not through recruitment. He found us. He had been doing research about Director Kwon, separately from you, completely independently. He found information about Kwon from a different direction. He made the mistake of trying to sell it." Jennifer's hand tightened on the phone. "Not to us," Ji-woo said. "To a rival faction. People who would have used it in a way that would have destroyed the Kwon arrangement and created a level of exposure that nobody in the structure could have survived. When Kwon found out, and he found out quickly, because Kwon finds out everything, he moved to eliminate the problem." The word eliminate sat in the air of that windowless room like something with a temperature. "I intervened," Ji-woo said. Jennifer said very quietly, "What does that mean?" "It means your brother is alive. It means that when Kwon moved, I moved faster. It means that Emeka Smith has been living under a different name in a city that I will tell you in a moment, and that he is safe, and that the reason he has not been able to contact you is because contact would have created a trail that Kwon could have followed." The phone was pressing hard against Jennifer's ear. She was not aware of having moved it. She said, "Why would you do that? Why would you protect him?" Another pause. Longer this time. Ji-woo said, "Because I knew who his sister was. And I had seen what she was capable of. And I had a sense, even then, that the day might come when the math of that would matter." Jennifer sat in that chair in that room and felt something move through her that she could not name and did not try to. He had protected Emeka. This man who had humiliated her and banished her and arranged her professional destruction had, at some point in that same period, quietly ensured that her brother was breathing. She did not know what to do with that. She genuinely did not know what to do with that. She said, "Where is he?" This is the moment everything changes. Drop a comment, "Did you see this coming?" And if you haven't subscribed yet, this is the moment. Because the conversation that comes next is going to change everything you think you know about both of them. Ji-woo told her. He told her the city, the neighborhood, the name Emeka was using. He told her which building and which floor. He told her that Emeka had access to money, not large amounts, nothing that would create a visible footprint, but enough to live. He told her that a person on Ji-woo's payroll checked in at a distance once a month to confirm Emeka was still where he was supposed to be. Jennifer listened to all of it without speaking. When he was done, she said, "And Director Kwon." "Still active," Ji-woo said. "Still protected. Still dangerous. And the files I have." A very small pause. "I know you kept a copy. I know you know." Another pause. Then something happened in his voice that she hadn't heard from him before, a quality that might, in a different man, in a different set of circumstances, have been described as rueful. "You are very good at what you do, Miss Smith." She said nothing. He said, "I want to make you an offer." She waited. "You take the information about Emeka. You take your freedom. There will be funds transferred to an account of your choosing, enough to relocate, to rebuild, to be comfortable for a significant period of time. In exchange, the Kwon files stay where they are. You don't surface them. You don't approach Interpol or any other institution. You disappear, properly this time, and you take your brother with you." Jennifer looked at the wall across from her. She said, "And if I say no?" He said, "Then we have a problem that neither of us wants." She said, "That's not what I asked." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "If you say no, I don't know what happens. I'm in a hospital bed, Miss Smith. I have somewhat reduced options at this particular moment." It was the closest thing to a joke she had ever heard from him. She didn't laugh. But something in her shoulders changed. She said, "I need to think." He said, "Take the time you need." She set the phone face down on the table. She looked at Ji-ho, who was still standing in the corner with the studied stillness of someone who was very good at being in a room without appearing to be in it. She thought for a long time. Not about whether to take the deal. She had known before the phone call ended that she was going to take the deal. She wasn't thinking about the decision. She was thinking about what the decision meant. About the specific moral geometry of her situation, which was more complex than she had the energy to fully map in that room on that day. She had spent 6 months building a plan to confront Kang Ji-woo. She had gotten into his elevator. She had been 60 seconds from implementing everything she had prepared. And then his heart had intervened, and instead of the confrontation she had engineered, she had spent 3.5 minutes keeping him alive, and the result was that she was sitting in a room being offered her brother's location and enough money to start over. The plan had failed. The outcome was what the plan was for. She had no framework for that. She picked the phone back up. She said, "I'll take the deal." Ji-woo said, "Good." Then he said the thing she didn't expect. He said it quietly, without preamble, in a tone that she would replay in her memory many times in the months that followed and never fully categorize. He said, "You didn't have to save me." Jennifer said, "I know." He said, "Why did you?" She looked at the ceiling of the room. She thought about 60 seconds on the floor of an elevator. She thought about the specific feeling of hearing her brother's name from a dying man's mouth. She said, "Because I needed you alive more than I needed you gone." A pause. He said, "That's a practical answer." She said, "I'm a practical person." Another pause. Longer. He said, "Take care of yourself, Miss Smith." The call ended. Ji-ho walked over and took the phone. He looked at her for a moment and then said, "You can leave when you're ready. There's a car waiting at the north entrance." She said, "My things." "Your bag is in the car. Your personal device is in your bag. Nothing has been accessed." She looked at him. He looked back. Then he said, very quietly, something that was clearly not scripted and clearly not endorsed by whoever had given him his instructions for this interaction. He said, "He doesn't say things like that." What he said at the end. "He doesn't do that." Jennifer said nothing. Ji-ho nodded once, like she had confirmed something he'd been thinking, and left the room. She sat alone for another minute. Then she stood up, straightened the coveralls she had been wearing for 3 days, and walked out of the room, down the corridor, to the north entrance, into the Seoul afternoon, and into a car that took her away from Yoon Tower for the last time. She did not look back at the building. She was done looking back at things. Hit the like button right now if this story is delivering. And comment, do you think Jennifer made the right call taking the deal? Because where this lands is not where you think it's going. She called Sonia from the car. Not to debrief. Not to strategize. Just to hear a voice that knew the whole story from the beginning and could sit with the weight of it without needing it explained. Sonia picked up on the second ring, which meant she had been waiting. Jennifer said, "I'm out." Sonia said, "Alive?" "Yes." Ji-woo. "Also alive." "He had a cardiac event in the elevator." A pause on the line. Then Sonia said, with a dryness that was both entirely inappropriate and the most comforting thing Jennifer had heard in 3 days, "Of course he did." Jennifer almost laughed. Almost. She told Sonia the shape of what had happened. Not everything, not yet, but enough. Emika's location. The deal. The Kwon files staying buried. Sonia was quiet for a moment after that last part. Then she said, "The files." "I know. The files could have dismantled Kwon entirely." "I know, Sonia. People have been trying to reach Kwon for 9 years. Those files were. I know what the files were." Jennifer's voice was level. "I also know where my brother is. And I'm getting on a plane." Sonia was quiet for a longer moment. Then she said, "Okay. Just that." "Okay." And Jennifer understood that this was Sonia choosing Jennifer's brother over an Interpol case that had been cold for 9 years, and she understood what that cost, and she was grateful for it in a way she would never fully articulate. "Thank you," Jennifer said. "For all of it." Sonia said, "Go get your brother." She booked the flight from the back of the car. One way. She had a bag at her flat that had been ready for 3 months, not dramatically ready, not a go bag in the movie sense, just a bag with the things she couldn't replace and not much else. She went to the flat. She showered for the first time in 3 days. She changed. She picked up the bag. She did not feel relief. She had expected to feel relief at this point in the story, and instead, she felt something that was heavier and quieter. Something that was the emotional equivalent of the sky after a very long storm, not sunny, just still. The particular stillness of something that has finally stopped. She thought about Ji-woo in that hospital bed. She thought about the elevator floor and his face and the specific terror of watching a human body fail. She thought about 60 seconds of stillness and what she had felt during them and what it meant that she had made the choice she made. She was not going to resolve that into something simple. She had decided that already. She locked the flat door and posted the key through the letterbox of the neighbor downstairs who had agreed, weeks ago, to manage the lease end. She carried her bag to the street. She got into a taxi. She went to the airport. She did not cry on the plane. She had thought she might. She watched the lights of the Korean peninsula drop away below the clouds, and she felt the heaviness in her chest shift, slowly, degree by degree, into something that was not yet peace, but was in the same direction. She landed 14 hours later. Went through customs with a composure that was not performance. She was simply too tired for performance. Took a connecting flight. Took a taxi from the airport to a neighborhood she had never visited, but had spent considerable time studying on a satellite map. The building was ordinary. 5 stories, terracotta-colored, a small courtyard in front with a tree that had lost most of its leaves. She stood on the pavement across the street and looked at the window on the 4th floor that Ji-woo's information had told her to look for. There was a light on. She crossed the street, went through the courtyard, found the intercom panel, found the flat number, pressed the button. A pause. Then a voice that reached back through 3 years and landed somewhere deep in her chest. Yes! Jennifer pressed her hand flat against the wall next to the intercom. Just for a second. Just to have something solid. She said, Emeka. It's Jennifer. The silence on the other end lasted long enough to make her heart do something complicated. Then she heard him breathe. Just breathe. The sound of a person who had been holding something for a very long time and had just put it down. He said, Jen. She said, open the door. She heard him moving. She heard the internal door buzz. She pushed through it and took the stairs because she could not stand still in an enclosed space, and she climbed 4 flights with her bag on her shoulder and her eyes already stinging in a way she had no intention of acknowledging. The door to flat 4C was already open. Emeka was standing in the doorway. He was thinner than she remembered. He had a beard she had never seen on him. He was wearing a gray sweater with a small hole near the collar. He looked like himself, and he looked like a stranger, and he looked like her brother. He said, how? She said later. She dropped the bag. She walked to him, and he met her halfway, and she held her brother in the doorway of a flat in a city that neither of them had any prior connection to, and the 3 years, and the silence, and the not knowing, and the fear. All of it came out in a way that had no words and didn't need any. They stood there for a long time. The neighbor across the hall opened her door, saw them, and quietly closed it again. If this hit you somewhere real, drop a comment below and tell me. And share the story, because this is the kind of thing people need to hear. Like, subscribe, and let's get to where Jennifer lands when she finally has time to think about all of it. 3 months later, Jennifer was sitting on a small balcony with a cup of tea that had gone cold. The city below her was new enough to still feel like a discovery. She had learned 2 words in the local language per day since arriving, a habit she had started as a practical measure and had come to actually enjoy. Emeka thought it was funny. He had been there longer and was considerably better at it, which he mentioned with more frequency than was strictly necessary. He was doing well. That was the thing she hadn't let herself fully believe until she could see it in person, and then in the weeks after, and then in the ordinary days that followed. He was doing well in the specific, unglamorous way that people who have been through something very hard do well, not untouched, not unchanged, but upright and engaged and genuinely present in his life in a way that told her the worst of it was survivable. He had nightmares occasionally. So did she. They had established, without discussing it in so many words, a protocol for this. Whoever woke up made tea, and whoever else was awake came and sat in the kitchen, and they talked about anything except the thing that had woken them. It was imperfect, and it was working. She thought about Kang Ji-woo more than she had expected to. Not in the way of unfinished business. Not in the way of anger, though the anger was still there. She wasn't pretending it wasn't performing a forgiveness she hadn't earned her way to. But in the way that you think about a thing that refuses to fit cleanly into any category you have available, and so it sits in a category of its own, one that you keep returning to because it doesn't resolve. He had banished her. He had dismantled 6 months of her professional life. He had arranged for her to sign documents and disappear. He had done all of that with the calm of a man who had never once considered that there might be a cost. He had also, in the same breath, the same long, complicated breath of his involvement in her life, ensured that her brother kept breathing when a man with the power to end that had moved to do exactly that. Jennifer was not going to call that good. She was not built for that kind of simplification, and she was suspicious of people who were. What she was willing to call it was true. Both things were true. The man contained both things, and she had saved his life in an elevator, and he had told her where her brother was, and now she was sitting on a balcony with cold tea watching a city go about its business, and that was what the story had produced. She thought about the elevator. She thought about 60 seconds. People asked her, in her own internal version of conversations she never had out loud, whether she had wanted him to die. She always answered honestly. Yes. For 60 seconds, she had wanted exactly that. She had let herself want it with a completeness that she had not previously given herself permission for. She had felt the full weight of everything he had taken from her and held it against the fact of his helplessness on that floor and found that the wanting was real. And then he had said Emika's name and the wanting had changed shape. Not disappeared. Changed. Into something that needed him alive and coherent and capable of speech, and the decision that followed was not noble. It was practical. She was a practical person. She had said that to him on the phone and she had meant it. But there was a version of the truth underneath that practical version that she was only now beginning to sit with. Which was this: in the 60 seconds before Emika's name, before the calculation, before the practical considerations, there had been a moment, very brief, very small, where she had looked at a person struggling to survive and her hands had wanted to move. Not because of strategy. Not because of information he might have. Just because a human being was in front of her and suffering and her hands had wanted to help. She was not going to make too much of that. She was also not going to make nothing of it. Emika came to the balcony doorway with his own cup of tea and looked at the expression on her face and said, "You're doing the thing again." She said, "What thing?" He said, "The thing where you sit very still and your face goes somewhere else." She said, "I'm just thinking." He said, "About him." A pause. Jennifer looked at the city. She said, "About all of it." Emika came and sat in the other chair. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Do you regret it?" "The deal?" She thought about the Quan files sitting encrypted on a drive that she had not destroyed and had not deployed. She thought about Sonia and 9 years of cold case. She thought about what those files could have done and what they still could do someday, under different circumstances, with different protection around the people they might endanger. She said, "Not today." Emika looked at her. She said, "Ask me again next year." He almost smiled. It was the closest to a real answer she was going to give him, and he knew that about her, and he accepted it. They sat on the balcony together in the ordinary afternoon of an ordinary day in a city they were slowly, imperfectly learning to belong to. Somewhere in Seoul, on the 40th floor of a building named for his mother's family, Kang Ji-woo was presumably doing exactly what he had always done. Running his empire. Managing his arrangements. Living inside the logic of a world he had constructed entirely according to his own rules. With a scar on his chest. And one debt on his ledger that had no payment structure, because the currency required didn't exist in his world. You cannot pay back a life with money. You cannot pay back a life with information. You can only carry it, the way you carry anything that has no proper home, and see what it does to the shape of you over time. Jennifer picked up her cold tea. Took a sip. Made a face. Emika said, "I'll make fresh." She said, "Please." He went inside. She could hear him in the kitchen, moving around, the ordinary sounds of a person alive and present in a small space. The most ordinary sounds in the world. The sounds she had spent 3 years not hearing. She leaned back in her chair. She thought, "I sleep fine." She thought, "Emika is alive." She thought, the elevator was very small and the world outside it did not exist, and somewhere in those 4 minutes something happened that she would spend a long time understanding and might never fully understand, and that was all right. Not everything needed to resolve. Some things just needed to be survived. She looked at the sky. She thought, "That's enough." She thought, "That is actually everything." The tea kettle began to whistle inside. Jennifer Smith closed her eyes and let the afternoon sun sit on her face. And that, in the end, is where we leave her. If this story stayed with you, if you found yourself holding your breath somewhere in that elevator or that balcony, then you already know what to do. Like this video, drop a comment telling me which moment hit you hardest, and subscribe because we have more stories coming that carry the same weight. Share this with someone who needs a story that doesn't let go. We'll see you in the next one.